Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of What's Jessica Reading Now? I am Jessica, a library clerk here at the Macedon Public Library and self-proclaimed YA bibliophile. So here is another rendition of the latest young adult novels I read over the course of the past month, and ones I would recommend to you as patrons to get through our library system, whether here at Macedon or through our interlibrary loan program. So the first couple of books that I'm going to be talking about today are actually a series that the second, it's going to be a trilogy altogether, and I just finished the second book. The third book, I believe, comes out in June of this year, either June, end of June or beginning of July, so somewhere around there. So we're getting very close to the conclusion of the series, which is why I decided to talk about it today. So the first book in the series is called Serpent and Dove. The author's name is Shelby, I believe it's pronounced Morin, so Mahurin. This is this author's debut novel, so this is her first published work. This book is not available here at Macedon. We don't have this particular book in our catalog, but it can be gotten. Several copies are available through the Interloan Library system. The basic premise of this, it is a fantasy YA. It's set in a fictional version of a country. It's very much so based on France. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of how to succinctly describe it. So the premise is, it is a basic sort of enemies to lovers trope. You have these witches, which are up to no good. So, and generally witches are doing bad things to people. And as a result, you have a sort of militant arm of the church called chasseurs, who are these male guards that protect the people from these female witches. So the basic setup is that it's very much so, even though it is fantasy, it's very much so based in relatable history. So the idea that women are seen as, you know, maybe these mysterious and sometimes even evil creatures, and then you have this church setting, which doesn't come into play too much, but it is the idea that the church is in power just below the king, and it's definitely based on, I would say, loosely based on Catholicism. Not to say anything bad about Catholicism. I'm just saying, like, I feel like that's kind of loosely what it's based on, but not directly. Just given the hierarchy of the clergy. So what you have here is you have our protagonist Lou, who is Louise, who is a thief and a bit of a scoundrel, and she is on the run from the law usually, and it's no real surprise that she is a witch by birth, although she has left the witches and is basically in hiding from them. And due to circumstances and a sort of a public scene that happens, Louise and our other protagonist, Reed Diggory, who is the captain of the chasseurs, have to end up being married to each other. And so it's one of those sort of marriage tropes. It's one of those, like I said, enemies to lovers tropes. This book really takes a lot of those sort of tropes that you may have read in other books, particularly in other romances, and it really puts a new spin on it, kind of really turns it on its head with the politics and the magic and the danger. Even though this is a YA novel, I would definitely say this is older YA. I think because this is this author's debut novel, I have a bit of a theory that it seems like for new authors, particularly ones that want to write fantasy that rely heavily on romantic elements, it seems to be easier for new authors to break into the young adult genre rather than going directly into adult fantasy. I don't know that that's for certain. It's just something I've seen, where you've seen a lot of this, particularly these female authors that start in YA and then they gather like a following and a popularity, and then they write adult fantasy. So just a theory I have. So I would just caution that this is on the adult side of YA. There is a lot of violence. There is some sexuality. There's some pretty high stakes. So it's a bit more intense than your average. So this book was a lot of fun. It was just good old plain fun to read. I wasn't sure how they would be able to turn this premise into a series, but I think that the author did a very good job of segueing those sort of basic tropes that you think can't go very far, like this forced marriage, this enemies to lovers, and building a world and a story around it that made you want to keep following these characters as they came up against these various challenges. So this is the sequel. This is the second book in the series called Blood and Honey. In this book, we're still following. Oh, I should say too that these books are a dual perspective. So the chapters follow either the perspective of Louise, or the perspective of Reed. So this book, I don't want to give too much away about the finale of the first book, but you're still following our characters as they have gone through some rather intense trials in the first book. They've got some enemies. Now it's the sort of thing where the tension is mounting, the stakes are getting higher, there's sort of pressure from all sides. Certain people they thought they could turn to for help, the help isn't there. Some people that they thought they couldn't turn to have been at least allies, maybe not friends, but allies. This book more plays on the mystical elements and the magic aspect, whereas the first book, because Louise was sort of hiding that aspect of herself, in this one, she's really giving herself over to it. And what got me about this book is that the author does such a fantastic job of weaving into this story and into this relationship without being heavy-handed, what it can be like when you are watching somebody go down a path that isn't good for them, but that they wholly believe is justified and correct. And those struggles, those interpersonal struggles of wanting to save somebody and not realizing that you can't save them if they don't see the need to save themselves. So it was kind of frustrating at times to see these two characters interact, but you also knew like that's exactly how that conversation would go when you've got one person that thinks they're coming from the correct side, the other person thinks they're coming from the correct side. And so it didn't feel like any of the conflict was forced, because it felt like, yeah, I kind of want to wring these characters' necks and like just tell them to get over it, but you also understood that it's like, that's what kind of what happens sometimes when you're just not able to see something from each other's perspective. So this book also ended on a high note of really wanting to know what happens next. So I'm super excited for the third installment, which is called Gods and Monsters, and it should be out, like I said, I believe it's the end of June of this year. So very excited for that. So I would recommend, definitely, if you want a more intense, it's a light but also intense read. But if you want something that's like fantasy and goes into that YA, but is also a little older, a little more mature, then I would definitely recommend this series, Serpent and Dove and Blood and Honey by Shelby Morin. As I said, the series will be wrapping up this year. So, and I can't wait to see what this author does in the future. Both of those books are available through interlibrary loan because we don't have them here at Macedon, but they're definitely worth getting. A standalone that I read is Treason of Thorns by Laura Weymouth. So this book I actually bought, and so I read it. I actually read my own copy, but I did get it in through interlibrary loan to show you guys that it is available through the library system. This book follows our protagonist, I'm blanking on her name, Violet. So it follows Violet Sterling, who this is sort of whereas the other book was an alternate version of a French, it's basically could be France in this series, but they don't call it France. This book follows an alternative version of England, in which magic is real but it's not something individuals have. It's something that these houses have, these sort of what would I call them? Places that then the magic radiates out, and the health of the land surrounding it is based on how healthy this house is. So in this version, it's a literal house, which is not to say that it literally has always been a house. It's just sort of like these monuments where the magic resides, but it's almost a sentient being. And at the beginning of this story, Violet's father, who was the caretaker of Burley House, in the very beginning, her father has been branded a traitor to the king. And what happens is the caretaker is then locked inside the house without this caretaker key that you need to channel the magic in a safe way. So if you don't have this caretaker key, you can still channel the magic through you, but it will slowly kill you. So it's basically a death sentence. And when Violet grows up, she gets word that her father has passed away, and she desperately wants to get back to Burley House to be the next caretaker, but the king is being very, very, very obstinate and basically telling her that the house is dying, and if it goes, so goes the land around it. But he also is not giving her the tools she needs to be successful. And then what unfolds is just such an interesting and entertaining, not entertaining maybe, but interesting and engaging, that's what I meant, story about loyalties, like where our loyalties lie, where our heart lies, how maybe certain things that we've been raised to believe about ourselves aren't necessarily true, and how you come to terms with that and how you change. There is a little bit of a romance, but it's not the main focus, not at all, not really. It takes a backseat to the sort of personal journey of the protagonist. So this book was one that I picked up at the local bookstore, the Dog-Eared Book in Palmyra, and brought it home and just didn't know anything about it and sat down and just really enjoyed reading it from cover to cover. So I would definitely recommend, if you want a single, standalone book that is just a good read, then I would definitely recommend Treason of Thorns by Laura Weymouth. It is also available through Interlibrary Loan. We unfortunately do not have a copy here at Macedon, but the final book I'm going to talk about is one that we do have here at Macedon. This is actually an adult fiction called In 5 Years by Rebecca Cyril. And this book is a bit of, some people have reviewed this book poorly, not for the writing itself, but because they went into it, and I did as well, expecting something different than what they got. So it's important to know with this book that you're not necessarily getting what it looks like on its face. This is contemporary fiction. It is not contemporary romance. So I went into this book thinking it was a contemporary romance, thinking it was going to be sort of a light and breezy, just New York City romance sort of thing. And it wasn't at all. And I could totally see how if you went into it expecting one thing, you could be very disappointed and almost a little angry. But if you know what you're getting into, then you can really enjoy the story. So I think that was just maybe a marketing snafu on the part of the publishers, that a lot of people went into this book thinking it was one thing and then being disappointed to find out it was something else. So the basic premise of In 5 Years' Time is that our protagonist, Danny, a young woman, has basically had her life, she's got her life pretty well figured out. She knows what she wants. She knows the timeline she wants to do it on. She's very career driven. She's also very driven in her personal relationship with her boyfriend, and she's got a plan basically. And when the book opens, her plan, everything's going according to plan. And just like clockwork, on right when she wanted it to happen, her boyfriend proposes, and that's where we open, is on the night of this proposal. Well, she gets I believe she gets a promotion to the position that she had been striving for. Her boyfriend proposes, becomes her fiance. Everything is going exactly according to plan, and she knows exactly where if you asked her where she would want to be in 5 years, she would know exactly where she was going to be. So the night of her proposal, she comes home, falls asleep, and has this dream that is something more than a dream. It's almost a premonition, in which she wakes up just as if she's woken up in that moment, and realizes it's 5 years into the future. She's in a completely different apartment. She's with a completely different man. There are obviously some sort of relationship between her and this man. And her life is nothing like what she would have expected it to be. And so when she wakes up from this dream, she's a little unsettled. Like, what could, because it didn't feel like a dream, it felt real. So what could that possibly mean? And then things really start to take off when her best friend introduces her, a couple of years down the line, her best friend introduces her to her new boyfriend, and it is the man from Danny's dream. And this vision that she had has sort of set her off her course. It's a few years down the road. Her and her fiance are still engaged, but they haven't set a wedding yet. You know, now her best friend has introduced her to this guy that is the guy from her dream, and she's wondering how could she possibly end up in a romantic involvement with this guy when it's her best friend's boyfriend, and they are clearly have a lot of feelings for each other. And then what happens is the book changes from what you think is going to be a romance to becomes more about the relationship between Danny and her best friend. And I'll go ahead, I don't really want to spoil things for people, but I feel like it's kind of important to know what's coming, is that her best friend finds out she has a terminal condition. So then the story changes to more about their relationship, the relationship between these friends. And it is really more of a book on change and grief, and the fact that you can't plan out your whole life, and that there are things that are going to happen that are beyond your control, sometimes devastating things. And how do you adapt to that? And how do you move forward? And is it a good idea to live your life by the numbers? Or is it better to maybe learn how to be a little more in the moment? So ultimately, once I figured out that this book wasn't what I thought it was, I really enjoyed it. But it helps to know what you're getting yourself into. Because if you think you're going into a light, breezy contemporary romance, you're going to feel like, you know, the rug's been pulled out from underneath you and there's been some kind of bait and switch, and you're not going to feel very kindly towards the author. But if you know what you're dealing with, then you can really read this beautiful story on these relationships and accepting change and learning how to change in and of ourselves, and how to grieve those things we can't control in life. So this one is available here at Macedon. So those are my recommendations for this month. Those are the books that I read. I hope you found something that you can maybe pick up and enjoy and get some new ideas. I will be back next month with a whole new round of books. And in the meantime, I hope everyone's having a healthy, happy time and enjoying this gorgeous weather that we have. So I will see you next time, and have a great day. Bye.